India's relationship with China has been complicated yet significant for New Delhi. Since 2020, popular conversations surrounding Beijing New Delhi ties have delved into the past, looked at the present, and opined on the future. In this context, a book published earlier this year, Crosswinds, by former Foreign Secretary of India, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, peels away the layers of the early decades of the India China relationship, focusing on ties between 1949 to 1959. The book looks at four principal actors: the United Kingdom, which was at that point till the end of World War II the preeminent power in the Indo Pacific, the United States, which after World War II became the power in the Indo Pacific that we still see that they are today, India, and Communist China. Today, the print has with us Mr. Gokhale to sort of discuss the books and look at it in today's context between ties between Beijing and New Delhi. Welcome, Mr. Gokhale, to the print.
Thank you very much.
So, my first question, and this delves from the first two chapters of your book, is between 1949, actually at the end of World War II, 1945 to 1949, we see a situation in China that has two governments: the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong, competing with one another in a brutal civil war, attempting to take control of China. In the middle of this, we have the United States approaching the situation from an anti-communist Cold War strategic perspective. The United Kingdom, which had multiple commercial interests, be it in Hong Kong, across China. They fought multiple opium wars a century before to get that commercial access. You have India, which a century before was a key player in the opium wars for the United Kingdom and now an independent Asiatic power. And then you have the communists and the nationalists themselves. In this great jockeying for power, we see multiple decisions being taken, and India being a preeminent Asiatic power at that point in time, and one of the few independent Asiatic powers, being approached by all sides. So, in this context, could you just sort of peel away the layers of this complicated situation that sort of led to India recognizing communist China as a country, formal recognition, far before any of the other global powers did? And how did we sort of get there?
Well, thank you for that question, Keshav. As you correctly said, at the end of the Second World War, the United States had become the dominant power. And in the Pacific theater, they needed an Asian country on which they could underpin their new dominance. Since Japan had been defeated, they settled on what was then nationalist China, the China ruled by President Chiang Kai-shek, as the most viable Asian power with which they could partner to maintain American dominance in the Far East. Now, of course, there was the still powerful, although rapidly fading British Empire. And as you pointed out in your question, there were fundamental differences of interests and different objectives that these two countries had vis-a-vis China. Once China became communist in 1949, a huge gulf opened up between them. And it is this Anglo-American competition over China that shaped India's policy not only towards the People's Republic of China, but towards the United States of America as well. Now, while these developments were taking place in the Far East, India gained independence, and our first Prime Minister decided that if India was to play a substantial role in redefining the Asian order and redefining India's place in that Asian order under Cold War conditions, it could not do it alone. We had neither the economic capability nor the military power, and he was of the view that we needed to enlist partners. Now, as you correctly pointed out, there weren't too many of them because a number of Asian and African countries were still under colonial domination. And the two obvious ones, Indonesia and China. And therefore, Prime Minister Nehru and the government of India became hopeful in enlisting China as a partner in building this Second World War order. And he felt that if India and China could work together, we could weather the pulls and pressures of both the major blocs in the Cold War. So at the back of Prime Minister Nehru's mind was this larger strategic vision of India and China becoming partners. And it is this which I believe led to the policy that we should give early recognition to the new regime in China after it had become obvious by the beginning of 1949 that the nationalist government was bound to fall sooner or later. Nevertheless, Prime Minister Nehru did not take any precipitate action. And my book, Crosswinds, explains how India's decision was vital for both the United States and Britain, and how they both exercised influence and even pressure in an effort to persuade India to support their positions, and their positions were diametrically opposite. So Crosswinds is really the story of how India makes foreign policy with both the Chinese and the Americans in a situation where the American and British interests are colliding in the Far East.
Right, sir. And one of the important sort of ideas that you put out in your book was the pressure from the US, especially in the after the formation of the People's Republic of China on the 1st October 1949, just before the then Prime Minister was going to visit the US puts out, conditions for which India should look for before recognizing China. And one of that was the recognition of international obligations. And India and China had multiple legacy international obligations stemming from colonial times, including the 1914 Shimla Convention, of which China never signed, but which sort of set out the McMahon Line as the boundaries between India and outer Tibet. And you sort of identify, for example, even the independent Tibetan government back then called for the return of Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, Bhutan, did not recognize these lines. The nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek, also is angered by India's opening to Tibet, but also does not recognize these treaties. And then you see the communist China continuing with those policies. So in that sense, if we look at the boundary issues between India and China, it stems from a colonial legacy, right? How do you sort of place that in understanding the sort of historical issues in the modern sense? Because this is something that even today is one of the biggest issues between Beijing and New Delhi.
Well, Keshav, the facts are fairly well known. In 1913, the British Indian government called for a tripartite meeting between the British Indian government, the Chinese imperial government, and the Tibetan government to decide on two things: where the boundary lay between what was called Outer Tibet, which was under China's control, and Inner Tibet, which was autonomous, and where the boundary lay between Inner Tibet and British India. Now, we must understand that China too agreed to this tripartite meeting and agreed to giving equal status to all three parties. The fact that they did not subsequently sign the agreement does not detract from this fact. And it is from this fact that the British Indian government and subsequently the government of India drew the factual conclusion that Tibet had the sovereign authority to decide where its boundaries lay, and that in the case of the boundary between Inner Tibet and British India, the Tibetan and British Indian government subsequently signed the Simla Agreement. So historically speaking, while the Chinese narrative might be different, the fact is that China had recognized Tibet as a party in the tripartite meeting, and subsequently the British Indian government felt that Tibet had the authority to sign a boundary agreement. Now, it's another matter that after India gained independence, the Tibetan government tried to renegotiate the agreements with the newly independent government of India. Now, this is a tactic that all governments follow. When there is a regime change, there is an attempt by other parties to open previous agreements and understandings. But that doesn't mean that these agreements are invalid. Notwithstanding that, it is a fact that both the Tibetan government of the Dalai Lama prior to 1949 and subsequently the Chinese Communist government have maintained that the Simla agreement is not valid or legal and that we need to renegotiate the boundary. And we all know thereafter in the 1950s, and I have detailed this in my book also, Crosswinds, how relations deteriorated and eventually led to conflict. Now, in a present modern context, when we discuss the boundary question, we, of course, must remember historical facts, but we must also understand present realities. The government of India has been in control of large swathes of territory which the Chinese notionally claim. There are populations there which are of Indian citizenship and don't wish to change that citizenship. And these two must be taken into account. And therefore, in the 2005 agreement, which both countries signed on the principles and parameters for resolving the boundary question, there is a specific clause which says we must take history and geography into account, but we must also take into account the current realities of settled populations. Now, of course, all treaties and agreements are a matter of interpretation, and until both sides agree on a boundary, there is no boundary. But we need to be clear that the historical facts support the Indian case. Now, what happens at the end is a matter for the two governments to decide upon.
Right, sir. And this is an interesting, another idea that you push in your book, a sort of the principal characters within the Ministry of External Affairs, the then Indian ambassador to Nanking, Mr. Panikkar, the Secretary General, Mr. Bajpai, and sort of the advice that the Prime Minister was given by different parties within the from the bureaucracy, right? How has that thinking in the late 1940s, early 1950s within the ministry sort of evolved to the present day, given that you spent so many years working within the MEA and on China specifically? So how has that evolution of India's approach to China looked like in the Ministry of External Affairs, sir?
In the 1940s, Keshav, we had an independent India with no real diplomatic experience. Neither the new political leadership nor the civil service which we had inherited from the British had been given exposure in foreign policy. And in a sense, therefore, the foreign policy was being driven more by the understanding of the personalities in the government than based on sound experience and sound advice. Now, it is in hindsight easy to condemn or to judge those who made foreign policy, but we must bear in mind this factor. Nevertheless, what I do reflect upon in my book is whether the government of the day could have engaged in a wider consultation on matters relating to China than they actually did. For instance, on the question of recognition, we know from many sources that there were significant voices within the government of India which were cautioning the government not to make haste in recognizing China. And among the well-known personalities saying this were Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel and the former Governor General of India, C. Rajagopalachari. There were others as well. The question is, was this advice heeded or was it brushed aside? The other thing was Parliament consulted? Because in a democracy, you need to consult the Parliament, and it did not appear as, or rather the Constituent Assembly, because in 1949 there was no Parliament, but were they consulted? Was this matter debated in the media? Because it was a matter of grave importance in terms of foreign policy. And my own indications through the is that not much was done to broaden the scope of consultation. So essentially, it was a decision taken by a select group of administrators and the political leadership based upon a partial understanding of this new China. Because almost nobody had contacts with the communist government prior to 1949. Prime Minister Nehru had had some contact in 1939, but a decade had passed and politics changes in a decade. Therefore, I do mention in book that it was more on untested assumptions that we proceeded to recognize China than on the basis of hard diplomatic fact. Now, of course, over the 75 years that India has been independent, a lot has been gained in terms of experience and in terms of building systems and processes for making foreign policy decisions. Today, you have the cabinet, which is quite integral to the making of policy. You also have the Cabinet Committee of Security, which consists of the four key ministers in the government dealing with home affairs, defense, foreign affairs, and finance, and the prime minister, as well as the national security advisor, which debate upon larger foreign policy and national security questions. Our opposition parties in parliament frequently question the government on foreign policy. We have a free media as well. And public opinion, thanks to the digital media, is becoming more and more active in making foreign policy and asking questions from the government. So I would say that today there is a process and there are systems in place and mechanisms that the government has built to ensure that we don't make foreign policy on the basis of untested assumptions. And we do try to ascertain the facts as well as to have face-to-face conversations with the other side in order to understand their point of view. Now, is this a perfect way of making foreign policy? I'm sure there is room for improvement. That is the case with all governments all over the world. But I am reasonably confident that we have in place a system which might, had it been in place in 1949, have allowed us to avoid making obvious mistakes. I'll just quote one instance since you mentioned this. In 1949, the United States, which obviously didn't want us to recognize China, gave us a piece of paper on which they had written down 4 suggestions, one of which was that the government of India should satisfy itself that the new Chinese government would respect previous understandings. Now, this is a fairly logical, non-partisan suggestion. Yet the government of India chose not to act upon it. The justification it gave was that if we raise the boundary issue, we are in some sense suggesting that it is not settled. That is an argument which, in hindsight, was perhaps a little naive. And had we posed this question, we might have learned of the problem a decade earlier.
Fair enough, sir. And just looking at the situations, and I think you sort of indicate this as well. While no two situations are the same, the present day situation in global geopolitics is such that there is once again competition after about 40 years of everybody looking at China as their best friend, especially after 1971 and 1979 with Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And there are studies that shows that the United States has invested trillions of dollars in Chinese growth for 30, 40 years. But today there is once again this perception of competition among the great powers. And then the question of India suddenly arises. We see the European powers sending delegation after delegation to come and meet with India. We see President Joe Biden in the US, saying that the Indo-Pacific and Quad are extremely important to the strategic thinking of the US. And then you have India once again trying to navigate this with retaining a free hand. And this is something that seems to be common in Indian thinking, whether it's Prime Minister Nehru or today Prime Minister Modi or Foreign Minister Jaishankar, is we must retain a free hand. We call it strategic autonomy. There are different terms, non-alignment back then. But we see this situation of competition once again playing. So in that sense, from your experience from reading through history and also being a part of this in the early years, especially Quad in 18, 19, 20, how do you see India viewing its foreign policy situation, competitions within the great powers?
Yeah, well, India has always considered itself big enough, large enough to have and to play an independent role and not necessarily abide by somebody else's view or worldview. This was true in the 1950s when the so called policy of non alignment was crafted. And it is equally true today when we talk of policy of multi alignment. Now, the important thing, however, is there is a fundamental difference between how we looked at the idea of strategic autonomy in the 1950s and in the 2020s. In the 1950s, we were a newly independent country born in the Cold War and saddled with two blocks on either side and pressure from both to join them. This was essentially a world that was divided by ideology or ideologies. And therefore, our non-aligned policy, at least to my way of thinking, was an ideological one. We didn't wish to side with either the ideology of either side in the Cold War. And that made it imperative to create a new thinking, which came to be known as non-alignment, to justify India's actions and strategic autonomy. Today, of course, the idea of multi-alignment is not predicated on ideology. It is predicated on interests, India's interests and concerns. And therefore, the idea of alignment or of alignment with one or another country is based on issues, not on ideology. By that I mean, if on a particular issue, it is in our interest to align with one or more of the other major powers, or even a select group of countries, let us say small island states or the least developing countries, then we will do so because it serves India's national interest. But on another issue, it is not necessary that we will align with the same country or countries because there our interests fundamentally differ. I think that's the essence of multi-alignment as explained by External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar. And this is very fundamentally different. Now, I do want to mention you can't compare the two eras because the 50s was a different time from the 2020s. But the final point I make in my book is important. One factor is constant, the problem of Taiwan and the Sino-US competition over this island or this group of islands. In the 1950s, each regarded Taiwan as an existential problem. Today, that is exactly the way in which these two powers are looking at this issue. And therefore, the stand that other Asian countries take, India in particular, because we are going to be a major economy and a major military and a major diplomatic force in the region, therefore becomes critical. Therefore, the argument I make is while history never repeats itself or rarely repeats itself, the lessons of how we acted in the 1950s, including on the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1955 and 58, has some lessons for us today. And perhaps it would be wise to look at them and then to judge how we make policy.
Right, sir. That was my last question. And thank you once again for this discussion, looking at the trajectory of India-China relations in its first decade and trying to take the lessons from that in today's situation. Thank you once again, Mr. Gokhale, for joining The Print.
Thank you, Keshav.